Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dan, and I just wanted to give you one more video before the release of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. As the new games come out, we're going to see a lot of new Pokemon, many of which we won't know how good or bad they are for a while. But as everyone's looking to build for early season VGC, I just figured I'd make a quick guide on how to evaluate new Pokemon. I'm not going to include any Gen 9 spoilers in this video. Instead, I'm just going to be talking about the basic principles of looking at a Pokemon and how to determine whether or not it's a good Pokemon or if it's just a mediocre or a bad Pokemon. As always, this is completely my opinion, although there are some hard and true facts in here as well. But watch this video with a grain of salt, take from it what you will, but this is sort of my evaluation process for new Pokemon when we see them, for determining whether or not they're good. The first thing everyone knows about is you gotta look at the Pokemon stats. And the first thing most people look about is the base stat total, or BST, but I like to use a metric that I've come up with that I call the eBST, or the effective base stat total. And I'm just sort of outlining it here with two very high stat Pokemon to show as an example. So you've got Arceus and you've got Crowned Zacian. They both have a base stat total of 720, which would make you think that they're the same, not taking into account typing, abilities, Movepool, just stat-wise. They are the same here. But when you look at the effective base stat total, Zacian is higher. So what is the effective base stat total? The effective base stat total is going to be the HP, defense, special defense, and speed of a Pokemon added with the attacking stat, either attack or special attack, that they will be using the vast majority of the time. So it doesn't really show flexibility between special attack and physical attack, and if there's a split Pokemon that you have to prepare for both ways, you know, there's some differences there. But the effective base stat total of Zacian is higher because its special attack is lower than Arceus. So why does that lower stat make it better? Because that means less of its total base stat total is put into a stat that it's never going to use, and those are instead distributed into stats that it will be using. So effective base stat total is the measurement that I like to use when I'm looking at the stats of a Pokemon to determine how good it is. Now, within the stats themselves, basically you get less wasted points, but within the stats themselves, the most important one for me to look at is the speed tiers. These are all obviously level 50 levels that I've got here because I'm talking about VGC, which is level 50 doubles. So on the left, I've got basically two baselines that I like to look at least for Sword and Shield. We had Tapu Koko and we had Dragapult. Tapu Koko had a base speed of 130 and a max speed of 200. Dragapult had a base speed of 142 and a max speed of 213. There are a lot of 130 Pokemon. Tapu Koko and Crobat are the two that come to my mind, but I know Aerodactyl's up there as well, so there's a lot of things that could use that speed tier. So in the middle, we've got different options on why you might be looking at one speed tier over another, but knowing your speed calcs is always going to be important. For example, at level 50, Pokemon with a base speed of 70, if you give it max speed and Scarf it, will have a speed stat of 201 because Scarf multiplies the max speed by 1.5. So a Metagross, which has a base speed of 70, can actually outspeed a Tapu Koko if it is max speed Scarf 100% of the time. But next to that, you've got a Primarina, which has a base speed of 60, which 60 and 70 both seem, you know, middle speed. There's not going to be a huge difference, but there really is in terms of what you're able to catch, because a Primarina with a Choice Scarf will never catch a max speed Tapu Koko. Comparing to Dragapult, for example, if you've got an Arctozolt, base speed of 55, if you give it Adamant, it goes up to 107 speed with 252 Adamant speed. And then with Slush Rush, it goes up to 214. So it will speed creep the Dragapult by 1 point, which is really good because then you can use an Adamant Ice move on the Dragapult. But if you look at Marowak under Tailwind, which is doubling, it only goes up to 212. So it will never outspeed a max speed Dragapult even under Tailwind, so the Dragapult will be attacking first. So these are just some random things to look at for speed. Obviously, these tiers aren't going to be the same for Generation 9 without knowing what the full Pokedex is there. But again, this is why it's important to look at the specific speeds that you might want to hit within a metagame while evaluating a Pokemon. And on the right, of course, You've also got to take into account things that operate better under Trick Room, and where low speed is better than high speed for Hatterene versus Snorlax, for example. And if you want to calculate that in the eBST somehow, this fastest Pokemon is base 200, so if you subtract 200 from if you subtract the base speed from 200, for example, Primarina, doing quick maths in my head, you get 171, and you might be able to calculate that into the eBST if you want to calculate eBST under Trick Room, but honestly that seems like more trouble than it's worth, but just something to keep in mind. Trick Room does affect the speed tiers, and is something to keep in mind if you choose to go that way, or if you want to have good answers to it. Beyond the speeds, you have to look at the abilities. I have a bunch of pretty common abilities that are all generally beneficial, although we'll be talking about one of them on the screen right here, but generally when you're looking at the ability in a vacuum to determine whether or not a Pokemon is good, you have to answer two questions. One, does this ability make this Pokemon better? For example, Speed Boost, Sand Rush, Huge Power, things like that. They will make your Pokemon better because it makes your Pokemon faster, stronger, something that makes your Pokemon more defensive, something that makes your Pokemon take less damage, that makes your Pokemon better. Or does this make my opponent's Pokemon worse? Something like Intimidate will make most opponent's Pokemons worse, not all the time. But a lot of the time, Intimidate will make opponent's Pokemon worse. So these are the two things you have to look at, and then you have to look case by case as well, because Levitate generally, yes, this is going to make my Pokemon better. It gives it an immunity that it didn't normally have. But if you take Rotom Fly, for example, it's an electric flying type. So Levitate actually doesn't do anything for it because it's already immune to ground type attacks. So instead of making your Pokemon better, it's a neutral ability that doesn't really add anything to the Pokemon, and that's why Rotom Fan isn't generally as good as the other Rotom forms, because its ability isn't making it better. After abilities, you have to look at move pools, you want to look at key support moves, and then you also want to have your offensive checklist. So this is not a full list of key support moves, but it's just ones that you want to keep your eye on. Again, these are things that make life more difficult for your opponent. You know, you've got redirection, sleep, buffing yourself, nerfing your opponent, screens to nerf your opponent, make an opponent flinch, speed control, on a bunch of various forms, other status conditions. Like, these are things that can shift the battle in your favor without dealing immediate damage or with low immediate damage in the case of Electro Web and Icy Wind. And then the offensive checklist, you want to check a couple things. You want to check the base power of the move, you want to check stab options, which is same type attack bonus. You want to check the coverage that a Pokemon has, which is attacks that it has that don't have the same type attack bonus. For example, if you look at Haxorus, it has a lot of coverage, but if you look at something like Glalie, it doesn't have much coverage at all. It basically only has same type attack bonus moves. So that's how you check coverage. Are there priority options? This isn't, you don't need to have everything on every Pokemon in this offensive checklist, but this is just ways to help evaluate a move pool. And then what are the secondary effects of the moves? And by secondary effects, I mean something like a Dracovish's Vicious Rend has a secondary effect where its power doubles if it moves first. It's a great secondary effect. Scald burns opponents 30% of the time. That's a great secondary effect. So frequency of a secondary effect triggering and what it does can really affect the offensive checklist as well. So the move pool of Pokemon, pretty self-explanatory, but it is something that you'll need to parse through in determining whether or not it's good. Now, I just have a couple last considerations that for determining whether or not a Pokemon is good when you're looking at the new Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. First, you got the niche. What role or roles on a team can this Pokemon fill? For example, if you look at Grimmsnarl, it can be a bulky attacker. It can also be a prankster support option, which is generally the much better set for it, but you can see that. And then you compare it to the rest of the format. In its roles, is this Pokemon the best, and what makes it stand out? What's the biggest difference between it and its competitors? So let's look at Grimmsnarl in that bulky support option. You also had Meowstic and Liepard that could have potentially filled that support role. They didn't have the bulk of Grimmsnarl. Meowstic wasn't a dark type, so it could be taunted by other prankster Pokemon. Liepard didn't have screens, and neither of them had the offensive presence of Grimmsnarl if you wanted to be offensive as well. So that's comparing the Pokemon to the format. Consistency. How often will this Pokemon be able to pull off the strategies that revolve around it? You know, you can have a Pokemon that doesn't pull off the strategies all that much. Like if you want to run something like Sheer Cold Suicune, yes, it's got a high power level. It can do a lot of things, but you're not going to be very consistent with it, and it's going to come back to beat your game. So consistency is going to be a lot of how frequently it hits calcs. Does it hit it 100% of the time? Does it hit it 1 out of 16 times? And what is the accuracy of the moves? Are you running only moves 70 to 85% accurate? Because that's not going to be very consistent. Or are you able to run 100% accuracy moves on this Pokemon? Obviously, you want to look at the Pokemon's type. Is the type combo a net positive or a net negative? Basically, if you're looking at it defensively, you want to avoid types like Ice and Bug that have a lot of weaknesses and not many resists. But offensively, stuff like Ice is very good, and then you need to determine is it in a more offensive or defensive niche, so that will really affect how you look at it. For example, Glastrier. It's an Ice type, so you think that the type might hurt it because it's not great defensively, but it's a very offensive Pokemon, and the offensive coverage of Ice Spike, along with its Steel and Ground coverage, actually gives it a lot of coverage, which makes it more of a net positive. The board state required for the Pokemon to be good. Does this Pokemon need something else to happen in a match for it to be good? For example, if you don't have Tailwind up, is this Pokemon still good? If you don't have Weather Control, can your Sandrush user still operate to some extent? If you don't have Terrain Control, are your Tapus still filling a role? For example, Tapu Fini. Even if you don't have Misty Terrain up, Tapu Fini is still going to be doing generally the same thing that it always tries to do. But if you look at something like Rillaboom, if you don't have Grassy Terrain up, you're not going to be getting off those priority Grassy glides, and it's going to be considerably worse. So this has to deal with consistency as well, but the less a Pokemon needs something else to happen around it to be good, the better it probably is. And then, is it fundamentally challenging for your opponent? When it's on the field, does it apply some form of pressure or make your opponent's life more difficult? Amoonguss is a great example of this. You don't know if it's going to Rage Powder to redirect an attack or if it's going to Spore to put something asleep. So it applies pressure on two different angles, and that's why it had to be nerfed so much that they actually made a new item to counter it, because of how much fundamental pressure an Amoonguss put on the field even without having a lot of damage. And back to a previous example, Dracovish. It applies pressure a different way. It has a delete button in the form of Fish's Rend. It can just kill something. So that's a different form of fundamental pressure and to be fundamentally challenging. So that basically wraps up this short little video I wanted to make about how to evaluate new Pokemon, because we're going to be seeing a lot of new Pokemon in the coming days, and it's going to be important to not just say this is good, this is bad, but to actually look at it, dive in, and understand why it might be good or bad. After the game's release, I'll actually be going over a lot of the new Pokemon, trying them on some VGC teams on the ladder when that comes out December 1st. So I'm looking forward to doing that, but thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time after Scarlet and Violet release. Bye.